I've come to the terms with the fact that I am not an emotional or spiritual speaker. It's not my gift. That's part of the reason why we have Matt here to do what he does. So to play more to my strengths, which would be more of a technical thing, I'd be much more happy describing the inner workings of an engine than I would be the Bible. We're going to stick with a more of an introduction into the Last Supper, and we're going to try and give it a bit more context, a bit more meaning, and maybe make the setting a little bit more colorful for us, so that maybe we can take a little bit more from the Lord's table when we go for it. So today's scripture will be from Mark, and it's Mark 14:12 through 26, and I'll see if I can find it here. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare the Passover so you may eat it?" So he sent two of his disciples and told them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a water jug will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, tell the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room for me to eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make the preparations for us there." So the disciples went out, entered the city, and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening came, he arrived with the 12. While they were reclining and eating, Jesus said, "I assure you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and say to him one by one, "Surely not I." He said to them, "It is one of the 12, the one who is dipping bread with me in the bowl. For the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." As they were eating, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them. And so they all drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood, that establishes the covenant. It is shed for many. I assure you, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it in a new way in the kingdom of God." After singing psalms, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So we get our reference to the upper room. There's a magazine we often have in the back here called The Upper Room. And the upper room in most of Christianity is a reference to this space that they had the Last Supper. And it's not anything fancy. And Earl, if you have that picture of the Last Supper, it looks just like this, more or less. This isn't exactly what happened. Not to say I don't appreciate this or appreciate the imagery of it, but it's not quite true to the setting that they had. In some of the biblical references, they actually refer to this space as an attic. And I don't know about you, but I can't think of many attics that would look quite as welcoming as that. We already, just right from the beginning, kind of painted the picture wrong. We've kind of given ourselves this image that we hold on to that maybe doesn't quite represent what was going on. The other thing that I notice when I look at that picture is I see a lot of bearded men. I see a lot of men with age. I see some folks who look like they're a little later in life. These aren't ripe young faces necessarily. But this is what we have as our image of the disciples. So to understand what a disciple actually was, disciples were not just with Jesus. In the Jewish tradition in the first century Judaism, a disciple was someone who followed a rabbi, and it was actually customary for most rabbis to have disciples. And so Jesus, being a rabbi, also had disciples, but his were much different. most of the time, being a disciple for a rabbi was actually a political thing or a wealth thing or a status thing, and families often petitioned rabbis to take their children as disciples. But one of the first departures from tradition that we see of Jesus is that that's not how he picked his disciples. He actually chose them. He went out and found who he wanted as his disciples. And that might seem like a minor distinction, but for me that kind of already sets the tone for the years of ministry that follow that. To instead, kind of turn away from this tradition in history of perhaps graft or political motivation or status or things like that, and say, no, I will find the people who I know will listen and take my message. And so that already is kind of an interesting thing. But another piece that just blows my mind when I look at that picture, because this is what we have in our heads, is that most of those guys are probably represented at double the age that they should be. Most of the disciples, historians believe that 10 of the disciples were in their teens. And we're not talking 18 or 19 either. We're saying 14, 15, 16. Which is a crazy thing to imagine. I have a hard time picturing that. 2 of the disciples, I believe it was John and James, were imagined to be in their 20s. One of them was married, and that's part of the reference we get that would indicate that for us. But this is a young group of men. This is not seasoned scholars. This isn't people with a lot of life experience under their belt. These are teens. Which then when we read through the scriptures and see some of the questioning and some of the doubting and some of the conversations that Jesus has with them, puts it into a different context, I feel. When we hear about Thomas, who's often referred to as doubting Thomas, not believing that Jesus had risen until he could see the wound for himself, you say, oh, he's been following him for 3 years. How does he not believe? Well, now make it a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old. How often do they believe what you tell them? So it kind of changes the perspective we have on these men when we think of it in that way. And so another thing, just as a point of discussion, oftentimes we use the word disciple, and we'll also use the word apostle. So a disciple is someone who's being taught. A disciple is someone who is following a teacher. An apostle is someone who's actually spreading the word. So the disciples, when they were with Jesus, were disciples. But when Jesus would ask them to go out and spread the word, they were then apostles. An apostle is more like a missionary or someone who's sharing the word with another person, whereas a disciple is someone who's receiving that word. So I just found that to be an interesting distinction. Okay, so if we go, I do have another verse, and I believe it's Mark 3. Maybe Earl has it for me if I'm lucky. Oh yeah, so here we go. Earl, what do you got there? So he appointed the 12. To Simon, he gave the name Peter, which I still don't understand. And to James, the son of Zebedee, and to his brother John, he gave the name Sons of Thunder. So, here, hold on, go back to that for a second. So for these two, the name Sons of Thunder, when you actually look at the references to this other word, which I cannot say, Boanerges, however you pronounce that, it's actually something more dynamic. You hear Sons of Thunder. What this is actually referencing is, when you walk into like a lively room and there's lots of people having discussion, but there's those couple of people that are kind of more energetic and a little bit above the rest of the crowd. They're those people who just really have the energy for discussion and have a fierce opinion. That is what we're talking about there. So in this description, what we're seeing is that James and John are two guys who are going to be willing to have that discussion and have it loud and proud, and are going to have an opinion on the matter. These are two men who are going to be heard when you see them. And so it just puts into perspective the dynamic of these 12 men. Okay, so go ahead, what do we got? And then Andrew, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they were not even able to eat. So what's happening here, this is earlier in Mark, and they're gathering for a meal. And I only point this out because Jesus actually names everyone. And so it's one of the few, we only have it a few times in the Bible where he actually gives us an account of all the people that were there. And so it's nice to see all of that there. Plus we get a few of those description words. We get Judas, who betrayed him. So obviously this is written as an after the fact, because otherwise they wouldn't have included that. Spoiler alert, Judas is the bad guy. And then we get the sons of thunder. We get Simon the Zealot, which I always think is kind of an interesting marking. But to say Simon the Zealot was actually a big deal in that time. So in first century Israel, they were occupied by the Romans. Okay, so it would be like, we're here, we're Americans, but Russia has come and occupied America. So it would be like us trying to live as Americans while being controlled by a whole nother state, a whole nother country being in control of us. And while they were allowed a certain amount of autonomy, they also were not. And so to be a zealot in first century Judaism was actually to be a terrorist. That is what it is. It's a terrorist. They were someone who is rising up against Rome. And to such an extreme that anyone who agreed with Rome or placated Rome or kind of went along with what Rome was doing, they oftentimes ostracized them as well. So it makes for a tough dynamic, because Matthew, for instance, was actually a tax collector for the Roman government. Well, I would imagine that Simon and Matthew probably didn't get along very well. These are two men who are on complete opposite ends of what's going on. And in all likelihood, Simon probably killed for his country. In all likelihood, he probably killed people to try and advance the Jewish nationalism that was going at the time. So we know now that these are young men. These are men of very different backgrounds and very different ideologies. We know that they're not picture perfect. I know normally when I picture them, especially my mom came up Catholic, so I had a little bit of that Catholic upbringing in there. So, half these guys are saints, and so they're put up on a pedestal in a different way. And so to think like that is not how crisp and clean this is. These men weren't all just fishermen who were brought out from the Sea of Galilee. There's a lot more going on here than that. So they had gathered for a meal. This is earlier in Mark, and Jesus named them all, but then he also makes another important distinction here that I think will play into the Last Supper when we get to it. So Earl, if you want to keep going. So when his family heard this, they set out to restrain him because they said he's out of his mind. This is because crowds had gathered and were stopping them from eating. They couldn't even, the disciples couldn't even have a meal with Jesus because so many people had gathered. Okay, and then then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him and told him, "Look, your mother, your brothers, and your sisters are outside asking for you." He replied to them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking about at those who were sitting in a circle around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." So what we have here is Jesus now, so he's already kind of laid to the side the ideas of what a disciple's supposed to be. He's got this group of a rather odd mix of young men following him. He's got crowds gathering, everything else is going on, and now his own family is there, and he's saying, that's not my family. If they were my family, they would have already been here with me. They would have already been in the room having the meal with me. They would have been along with me on this journey the whole time. Now, that's not to say he's going to ostracize his mother or anything like that, but that he's laying an importance on your faith and being with him. And he's saying, if you have faith and you believe, you are now my family. You are now my brother. You are now the person who's here with me. You're the person who's getting the invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. So now, when we go to the Last Supper, it puts into a little bit different perspective the gentlemen who are sitting with him. These aren't just the guys who have been following him for the last 3 years trying to learn his word. These are the people that he's picked that are an odd mix but he believes need to be together. And he's saying, these men are my family. These men are the one who carry my lineage. Because that's what we do with our family. Our lineage is carried down. And so these are the men who are going to carry my word and my teachings on beyond me. So I think, Earl, did you have that slide with the disciples for me? If you could. I know this might be hard to read. Oh, I know. Yeah, sorry, folks. Earl doesn't have his glasses today. So we're flying blind, quite literally, between the two of us. Do you have that the sheet of the names of the disciples? Okay, never mind. I missed it. My bad. So what we have is, just to give a quick rundown of some of the disciples, okay? Out of the 12 disciples, only one died of natural causes. One. And that was John. All of the, 10 were martyred, and one committed suicide. So, I think that speaks to the level of commitment that they had to this family that they had created as they were basically creating Christianity. Almost all of them were fishermen, but not all of them. We have the tax collector, as we spoke. We have Simon the Zealot, but Simon wasn't the only zealot. It's actually believed that Thaddeus was actually a zealot. And in all likelihood, Thaddeus' brother was also a zealot, though we know very little about it, which would be James the Lesser, which I always thought was a horrible nickname to have to get out of the group. And James the Lesser, oddly enough, was actually sawn into pieces for his faith, which is a pretty gruesome thing. Bartholomew was flayed with knives. 2 of the disciples were crucified. Thaddeus was killed with arrows, and Thomas was actually killed with a spear. It's a pretty gruesome end for most of them. And it's interesting to think that they stuck together and still spread this word and oftentimes worked with one another. There were groups of these guys who did continue to speak with one another after Jesus' death. So it just kind of, an interesting thought for how young that they started out. So the Last Supper, we've already read the verse. It starts with the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Is anyone familiar with the Festival of Unleavened Bread? It's Passover. Yeah, we refer to it in a different way these days. It's Passover. Now, the reason they refer to it as unleavened bread is because when the Jews were exiled in the desert some thousands of years prior to that, they were fed manna from heaven. And that's how they survived for 30 days when they were in the desert, was from this manna from heaven. And it was actually an unleavened bread. And so in honor of that, they have a festival every year to commemorate that. And they still celebrate Passover to this day. And so when we do communion, we have this beautiful leavened bread that we eat, and I would not have it any other way here because it's just delicious. But in a lot of the original interpretations, you ate unleavened bread because the leaven was supposed to be a representation of man or a representation of sin. And so by not having the leavening agent in it, it was meant to eliminate the sin or eliminate man from the equation. Now, in large part, could we say that that's a piece of symbolism? Obviously so. And is it more important that we observe the tradition as a whole? Certainly. And so it's not something necessarily for us to get hung up on, but that is the origination of it. And so, along with this Festival of Unleavened Bread, this was not something that you had a choice about in first century Israel. If you were a Jew in first century Israel, there were a lot of rules about the way you lived your life, the way you lived your Judaism. And we're quite different from that now. As Christians, we enjoy this ability to live our faith in many, many different ways. And at this time, it was actually, there were so many rules that it became a burden to even be Jewish. So, for instance, at the time, Jerusalem was about the size of Waitsburg in physical size. So if you were to put a wall around Waitsburg, you would have first century Jerusalem in size. But now you need to put 25,000 people in it. So now picture Waitsburg with 25,000 people, approximately 20 times what we have now living here in Waitsburg. Things would get a little crowded a little quick, right? And so now add to it that you're not allowed on your Sabbath or on Passover or on high holy days to walk more than a certain number of paces from your home. That's actually that was part of the Jewish law at the time. So what that turns into is that in an area the size of Waitsburg, there's 480 Jewish synagogues. 480. So picture Waitsburg with nearly 500 churches in it and 25,000 people. It starts getting a little bizarre. It starts getting just a little crazy to think about. Then, on top of that, if you were Jewish, you were required by law to tithe to the church, to the synagogue, right? So you had a tithe that you had to give to the synagogue. Then, on certain holidays, you were required to return to the city. Well, to return to the city, you were required to pay a gate tax because the city was walled and there were only so many entrances. And so to come into the city to do the praying that you needed to do for the holiday, for your faith, you had to pay another tax. And then if you were to stay in the city past a certain amount of time, you had to guarantee that you spent at least 10% of your income within the city as another form of tithe to the people of Jerusalem. It starts again getting just a little bit muddy and confusing. It just, the times that these men were gathering like this was a bit helter-skelter. There's a lot going on here. And so oftentimes when we read about Jesus meeting in Bethany, for instance, he doing things, that's just outside the city wall. Well, they were doing that for a reason. It's because it was a pain to get into Jerusalem. They only went in there when they had to. So we get finally to these men. They gather for the Last Supper. They're gathering much the same way they did in that other story earlier in Mark, except for without the crowds. They don't have the crowds with them this time. So the 12 men plus Jesus get to gather together to have the meal. And in some of your Bible versions, it'll say that they gather at a table. In some, it'll say that they recline with one another. At the time, there weren't tables like this in most Jewish households. That's not how you would have eaten. And in fact, what it likely was just a blanket or a slightly raised area of the floor that you would sit around. It's not a big area either. It's entirely unlikely that a space quite that large would have existed for them to just gather in without it having been belonging to somebody wealthy or in power, which we don't think is the case because that would have likely been mentioned in the story. So to help demonstrate what this actually would have looked like, I have a number of wonderful volunteers today, plus Kurt, who doesn't know he's volunteering. Is he up here? No? Oh, then that means Gabe. So Gabe didn't know he was volunteering. And what we're going to do, and I know you guys are going to have a hard time seeing this, but please bear with us. If I could have all those youth that I talked to this morning just come sit in this first pew for just a second. Gabe, if you wouldn't mind coming up and taking a seat wherever you would like around this blanket, if you could, okay? So Gabe, you just sit wherever, you guys, if you could just wait by the front for just a second. And there are a couple rules to this interesting game. Okay, so the first thing is you have to sit by the blanket in such a way that if there was food on it, you could reach it and eat it. Does that kind of make sense? Okay? And the second rule is, without being rude to your fellow disciples, you want to sit as close to Jesus as you can. Because that was actually a big thing. Where you sat in relation to Jesus was a very big deal. Okay? So, do you guys all know Gabe? You guys all know Mr. Kiefel? Yeah, okay. Okay, he doesn't bite hard. And so if you guys could try, I know it's a small blanket, but if you guys could try to sit around that blanket in such a way that you could have eaten off of it. Ready, set, go. Go for it. Just go. There's a lot of you, remember that, and you want to be able to reach it. Oh, see, he knew. He squeezed right in there next to Jesus. He knows what's going on. Okay, so now when I look at this group, we're one shy, but we're not bad. Now, for those of you out here, if you can't see, please stand up and look. Look at this group and look at that group. And I think we'll all say that this is a really big difference. The way in which you eat with one another when you sit at a table is a different kind of meal than when you're forced to be right beside one another like this. Most of these guys, I see, we've got some people who are having to lean on an arm. In all likelihood, we're actually short a person, so there should be one more person up in here. You're oftentimes going to have to hand each other the food. It changes the way that we eat. This isn't a, please pass the mashed potatoes and a bowl comes down the table to you. This is a, would you hold the other end of this piece of bread so I may rip off a piece? It's a different kind of closeness with one another, okay? And because you guys feel a little close down here, don't you? Right? And if you didn't know each other well, this would be really awkward, right? Right? To have to share a meal like this would be kind of difficult, wouldn't it? Yeah. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. Okay. So I mentioned all of this, and this is a really long ways to go, for us to get to the fact that when we come to the communion table, we have been invited to sit at that blanket. That's really what it comes down to, is that when you come to this table, you're actually being asked to sit with Jesus at this blanket. So for those of us who sometimes maybe feel distant from Christ, maybe we struggle with feeling the proximity to him or feeling like we're being touched or in a circle with Jesus, one of the things we can remember is that this table isn't just about the absolution of sin, but actually also to bring us in to Christ's family and sit here with him and hold the bread for him while he breaks it and dip our bread in the same bowl as him when we dip it. It takes us to a different place when we picture it in the right context. And a lot of the Bible is about context, and sometimes we get hung up on just the words on the page, but there's actually a much richer, much deeper, much bigger picture when we kind of soak it all in and take it as it happened, kind of. So, with me, I hope you guys can kind of take, as I did from this message, some of the interesting bits about what Jesus was doing when he put that specific group together, and also about how it was that he was going about it, and how that relates to us in what we are actually doing. So that next time we're struggling with feeling like part of the Christian family, we realize that each week here in our church, we're being invited once again to take that seat. So, thank you.